On today's podcast, we have Hugo Silva, a partner at Pi Labs. So thank you so much again for joining us. And I guess my first question for you is, congrats on becoming a partner earlier this year at Pi Labs. It's really amazing to see your growth over the course of the years there. And I know that when we've spoken in the past, you didn't necessarily always look at yourself as being a venture capitalist. What would a young Hugo say to himself now, or a Hugo at engineering school say to himself now about the role that you're in?
First, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you for the congratulations. I think I told you this before, but I think if I met young Hugo going through engineering school, the first thing I would tell him would be there's more to life than university. Way back when I was doing my engineering school degree, it was quite intense, and that was the way things were done back then, right? It was very intense. You studied for a very, very long time with the purpose of becoming a very, very technical person. That's not necessarily what happened afterwards. And actually, most of my friends that graduated alongside me are not necessarily engineers today. And I think one of the things I would have liked to know back then is that the world is flexible. You don't need to always be who you originally thought you were going to be, and you need to also be able to adapt to that. So I started out as an engineer. I did that for about a year or so. And then in the meantime, I was lucky enough to find out a little bit more about startups, about venture capital, and the company I worked for had a corporate venture capital arm. And I thought, why not give it a go, right? And that's kind of how my career in venture capital started.
So you got your foot in the door and you got a start in the VC, but I'm curious, what kept you hooked on VC as you've moved forward over these last years?
Yeah, to be fair, the beginning was quite different to, for example, what I see the young talent that we're recruiting these days goes through. I spent 3 months reading contracts, right? Really understanding how shareholders agreement works, or what a term sheet is, or like what do even startups do? Because not everyone understands what a startup is, what a venture capital fund is. I still struggle explaining that to friends and family back home. But I think that looking back, it was a really, really interesting experience in the sense that I had a very technical background, but my whole family was in the financial space, right? And so I kind of always wanted to know a little bit more about it, but venture capital allowed me to basically merge those two worlds together, right? The more financial side to the more engineering, to the more technical side that I had from my training. Now, what really keeps you hooked, I think, is meeting founders. I know it's a very cliche answer.
Very cliche.
But it is true. It is true. I'm always curious about meeting people that are a lot smarter than I am, particularly when they're passionate about that one particular thing. And I have no shame in admitting that there's tons of people out there that are way smarter than I am, and I want to be surrounded by them. And that's what being in VC enables you to do, is just meeting these incredible people that have gone through the problems themselves, that have come up with a wild way of solving all these issues. And that's what really keeps you hooked, right?
Sure.
But yeah.
I think that's interesting, and I think that's a really cool way of putting it. And while it is cliche that we always say meeting with founders is the best part of the job, I would also agree that there's nothing like meeting with someone who has a vision for what they see the world or want the world to be, and are actively trying to take roles and opportunities to bring their fantasy into reality. And it takes a special kind of person, regardless of a level of intelligence, to be able to be crazy enough to want to undertake that task. And it's really, I think, inspiring to have an opportunity to speak with people like that all day, every day.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why I find it really hard for myself to ever become a founder, and I really admire people that do, they're the real heroes out there, is I know how venture capital works. I know how VC funds work, right? And I cannot imagine how a founder who's a specialist in whatever area they're in, having to go head to head with venture capital funds that probably have no idea about the product they have, about that particular industry. And we see a lot of this in the built environment, because we do talk to a lot of generalist funds who have some understanding of real estate construction, but not necessarily about some of the more deep tech issues. And I can only imagine how it must feel for a founder to go head to head with these people and have them and being told, well, your solution's just not good enough, or your market is not big enough, or we think there's too much competition, which might be fair, might be a fair point, but it must be so frustrating. So I really admire the resilience that these founders have and need to have.
I'm curious if you get this question or you get this feedback at all. I know that we get it a lot at Xpress Ventures when we are talking to founders, which is, oh, we're so happy that you understand what's going on.
Oh,
we're
yes.
so happy that we don't have to explain everything to you from scratch. And it's such a relief that they have when they're able to have a conversation with us at not the 10,000 foot level, but at maybe not necessarily the underground, but at 1,000 feet or at 500 feet. And I'm wondering if you get the same feedback from founders in the built environment.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You really hit the nail on the head there, because, for example, we managed to look into Y Combinator deals that other people might not look because they don't understand the space, right? And the founders just, like you said, they're just relieved that they're talking to an investor that understands their space a little bit more. There is absolutely room for generalist funds, right?
For sure. And we need them because they have a lot of capital.
They have a lot of capital.
Please co-invest.
Absolutely. I think what is needed, particularly in those early days, we're talking pre-seed to Series A, is someone that understands what the problem is, what else is out there, how are you different, and because otherwise it's going to take a lot of education, a lot of evangelization of your potential investors before they even begin to feel interested in your business, right? And so it helps that you're talking to someone that already understands a little bit about what you're trying to achieve as a founder. But like I said, we still love generalist funds. We want them to develop those theses, and actually we're starting to see quite a few generalist funds not going focused on just one vertical, but maybe choosing 4 or 5, and sometimes one of those 4 to 5 is built environment. So it's slowly starting to change.
And I think it's going to accelerate in that direction in the future as more people need to find, something special that they can offer founders in addition to cash. There needs to be some know-how there. And like you said, specifically in the early stages. So to get into a little bit of the meat of it, and we talked about your background and we're sort of talking around the built environment, let's talk specifically about Pi Labs and the investment thesis of the firm.
Sure. I'll give you a little background story there. So the fund itself was set up back in 2015 by CEO Faisal Butt, and the reason why he set it up was because he had been around the real estate environment for a bit. He had looked at some technology-enabled real estate companies, and so he wanted to back some of them, right? And that's kind of how Pi Labs came to be. I think back in 2015, the word prop tech wasn't really used that much. I think it was coined back to the year before that, right? Okay. So it was that new. And so we set up our first fund, very simple proposition. Let's back 10 companies, see if we can find something out there. Turned out there was more than enough companies. We had thousands of applications. We ended up picking 10. Those 10, we've had some very, very successful exits, and we then went on to raise 2 and 3 additional funds. Now we're on our fund number 3, which is a $90 million fund, and the premise is very simple. We want to back innovators within the built environment, typically pre-seed to Series A, that are basically changing the way we interact with the world around us. Right.
I'm going to interrupt you here to sort of get for the audience and for people who may not be super familiar. And I think we use a lot of lingo in the VC world. And I'm curious, how do you all define sort of prop tech and how you define the built environment? Because there is a little bit of a difference there with respect to...
There is. You're absolutely right. I think prop tech tends to be a little bit more on just the property management side, like on the development side, whereas when we talk about built environment, we're thinking about the entire value chain, right? So the way we define built environment internally is under 4 buckets. One of them is sustainable construction, because you need to build buildings, right? Once the building is built, we go into our second bucket, which is efficient buildings. Buildings need to operate efficiently, whether it's in terms of occupancy or in terms of energy usage. Finally, thirdly, a collection of buildings makes a city, right? So we have a bucket for sustainable and healthy cities. We need to make sure that we have all the adjacent services to service a city. For example, logistics, data centers, warehouses, last mile delivery, all of that fits within that space, including things like cybersecurity, which a lot of people wouldn't necessarily associate with built environment. And then finally, the last bucket is comprises the 3 main food groups of the built environment, which is future of work, future of living, and future of retail.
I'm curious, how does infrastructure inside of cities, so obviously we need to think about, we talk about energy as one, I think, infrastructure element that's, I think everyone can understand, but, the sewage and all of those things also play a role into what you all consider to be the built environment. And I'm wondering if you see opportunities in those spaces as well.
Absolutely. We backed a really, really interesting company called Untap Health, and super smart founder, comes from the wastewater management. It's like a 2nd or 3rd generation person within the wastewater management space, which is not common at all. And what they've done was they've repurposed the PCR tests that we all love and hate. They've repurposed them because instead of being just 1-to-1, they've created a little machine that allows you to test wastewater continuously. Right.
Interesting. And then that's used for public health analysis.
Used for public health, allows you to understand, I think today, up to 9 different types of viruses and bacteria. And so you can figure out if a building, it can be done in an individual level. So if a building is under contamination, or a neighborhood, or citywide, it depends on how many of these devices you want to use. So this is definitely a cause for our concern, because for concern for us, because if people are ill, it means that they're going to miss out on work. It means that productivity goes down. It means that we need to spend more through the NHS and other health services. And so anything that we can do to make sure that people can live life to the fullest makes sense to us.
I'm curious now to sort of change the topic a little bit. How I know that decarbonization is a core tenet of the work that you all do. It's sort of based on our conversation, an umbrella under which all of the activities that you invest in sort of take place. I'm curious how you all sort of look at the work of decarbonization and how you might relate that to, overall impacts that, there's a huge climate tech boom right now that has people interested in the deep tech element. And obviously you all do that as well from a built environment perspective, but I'm just, how do you all look at sort of this goal of decarbonization, and how do you evaluate companies on that when they may not necessarily be focused directly on decarbonization as a goal?
Very good question. So like you said, it's an umbrella that is just across all the buckets that I mentioned before, right? So for example, within construction, we're looking at things like material science, and we're looking at ways to track the materials that come onto site and make sure that everything that is waste is secured in the proper manner. However, it is challenging to evaluate all these companies that come from a sustainability mind frame, because you tend to see a lot of the same thing, right?
Yes.
And so you even though I have that background, I don't claim that I'm an expert in sustainability. I'm not an expert in anything, to be fair. But we do have experts that we work with. We have a venture partner that specializes on sustainability, on ESG, even though we hate the term ESG these days.
But it's been overused.
Overused, but he does focus on decarbonization. He's done his PhD thesis out of Oxford, and he's been basically the person that we rely on to make sure that whatever company we're looking into, whether they are focused on sustainability or not, that it is analyzed from a sustainability lens, right? Whether it where it aligns to the standards that we have here, like BREEAM or GRI or whatever it is, to make sure that we categorize every company properly.
Do you all look at other types or have other types of experts that you work with who help evaluate? Because obviously you all do like deep tech stuff. So there's some heavy science stuff. Obviously you have an engineering background, so you're able to look at stuff that's more sort of construction related or in the engineering realm. But I'm wondering, do you have chemists or biologists or other kinds of people on the Pi Labs team that can sort of look at these deals?
Great question. So on the chemist one, you kind of there's an interesting story there, because one of the reasons why we haven't really invested in materials yet is because we don't currently have the expertise in house, right? So we don't invest in things we don't know or that we can't find out more about. Yes, we can go out and find potentially an expert to help us, but we really want to have deep understanding on things that are as critical as materials, because it tends to be very deep tech. Now, for other areas, we do have experts in plenty of functions, right? So, for example, we have a venture partner that helps within sales, right? So he has 3 decades of expertise at IBM. He's sold to pretty much every company out there, and he can look into a company and understand, do they have a good sales machine? Is this a repeatable process? Does this mean that for every pound I put into this business, I get 2 pounds back, for example, right? We have another expert who's a tech lead. He's an ex-CTO. He's founded plenty of businesses. His questionnaires for the CTOs are really, really, really deep. It goes down to like, what kind of language are you programming? How are you thinking about security, right? How are you handling data? It goes down to GDPR questions. It's very, very detailed. We have another venture partner who specializes specifically on deployments. This is quite new for us, but really interesting, because our own investors, our limited partners, our LPs, all come from the real estate world or the built environment world. And we want to make sure that we're backing companies that they might think of using one day. And so we have this venture partner that comes from the industry that has implemented a ton of tech companies at real estate companies. And therefore he looks at them from that perspective. Do I see this company being used by our industry or not? And what's the framework in which that could happen? And he works with them to get there. And then finally, for more advanced businesses, for example, we have somebody who looks at financials in a very, very deep way. So we have all these experts that help us. And what we're trying to do is just collate all this evidence that they produce and try to make a judgment on it.
We haven't talked about your deployment strategy. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of founders you're looking for and what kind of tickets you're writing?
Yes, absolutely. So like I said, we basically start investing at pre-seed. We have a growth program, which is a 12-week program, 350,000 ticket, which is very, very blanket. We do it as a save to be very fast, very quick. They join for a 12-week program, which is solely focused on growth, right? Does the name growth program. So we're talking about companies that usually already have some pilots, typically pilot revenue that is coming in. And we want to use that program together with our LPs and extended network for them to sign their first contracts, right? So that is our pre-seed bucket. Then when we're talking more about seed, pre-series A, series A, we can go up to £2 million. If we're doing a series A, we tend to be a follower. If we're doing seed pre-series A, we can lead those rounds, preferably co-lead. We like to have syndicates. We like to have other people join the table and add value. I know that's used quite a lot, but we do think that we know what we can do. We know what we can't do. And for example, yes, we can potentially find you some customers in the US, but there's better people out there that can help you with that, right? If we are backing a cybersecurity company, yes, we can understand how it works and give you some deployment case studies. But in terms of product development, we probably need a cybersecurity venture capital firm, right?
So I know that you have a deep Rolodex of LPs in the real estate space. I wonder, what is it like for the startups who are in your pre-seed program, and what is it like for startups that are in your portfolio to work with these incumbents? And are there any examples or positive examples or negative examples that you pull from as exemplary for, best practices for working with corporates versus worst practices for working with corporates?
Yeah. I think the key question is they both need to be ready, right? We have about 70 LPs within our 3 funds, and some of them want to just have an understanding of what is out there, and they're not looking for deployments, and that is absolutely fair. But if you are looking for deployments, then you need to have a structure put in place, and you need to have buy-in from different business units. You need to make sure that, for example, if you're doing something around their sales process, you need to make sure that their head of sales is bought in, for example, right? It can't just be the head of innovation or just the CFO that's pushing for a deployment. On the startup side, they need to be ready to wait for a very long time for contracts to close. They need to be ready for
Define a very long time.
We see anywhere between 6 to 18 months of sales cycles, really depending on the type of customer, the type of project, but they need to be ready to wait. And so that means 2 things. 1, make sure that you're well capitalized, and 2, make sure that you have everything ready that a potential customer might ask of you. That's true for our own investors, but for anyone else. Now, there's been some really interesting success stories. There's one particular one, which is a company based out of here in UK called Contilio. They've deployed with one of the largest developers in the Emirates, a company called Aldar, which is also one of our investors. And the way it started was, it was a very well-defined phased approach. So they started with a small pilot, which was basically doing 1 floor. Then they moved to a whole building. Now they're overseeing a whole neighborhood, right? And it was all very, very well planned. And so if you have that plan in mind, then it makes the deployment easier, because doing pilots is easy, right? We have LPs that do 15 pilots a year.
Yeah.
How many of those companies convert into contracts? Maybe 1 or 2. That is the key. You need to make it very easy for your customers to think that it's a no-brainer to sign up, right?
And for those LPs that are engaged, or these corporates that are in the real estate business, what value do they see from having all these pilots? Do they communicate that back to the PiLabs team as to, they're doing 15 pilots and maybe they're getting 1 contract a year that they're going for, but what value have they sort of shared with you all that they get in continuously seeing what's fresh in the market?
It obviously depends on the company that they're piloting with, right? But for example, in Contilio's case, they've told us that the result of one of the pilots was, for example, they saved about $3 million worth of reworks, right?
Wow.
Because they managed to find a mistake in a floor that, if it had been corrected through the usual process, which means 4 to 6 weeks later, and in the Emirates, they build things really, really fast. So that means that 4 to 6 weeks later, you're talking about 2-3 floors have already been built on top of. It means that all these reworks are quite expensive. So the company basically paid for themselves with just that one mistake that they found, right? The story is a little bit more convoluted than that, but in essence, they see value if the product is good, right? It is something that we try to work closely with our founders, is finding that return on investment, that ROI that they can then pitch to either our LPs or other customers. This is what you'll get if you sign up for us, right? It's really tricky to get there, and that's why they need to do all of these pilots. But if you get there, then you automatically sell your product. Now, from the pilot perspective, our LPs are looking to see what is out there and how can they do things more efficiently in a greener way. And like our investment thesis, digitalize and decarbonize the built environment. That's the main goal that pretty much every built environment company, every real estate company out there has.
When we look at sort of the role of these LPs and the role of these incumbents in helping startups scale, I wonder and always think about what challenges there are for these startups to scale. And as we look at the built environment, what would you say are some of the biggest hurdles that must be overcome by founders as they seek to work with not only incumbents, but oftentimes governments, and to sort of change an environment that has been that way because people built it that way intentionally, maybe hundreds or sometimes even thousands of years ago?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things that can be challenging, especially once you get the ball rolling and you start securing contracts. One of them, the main one that we see, is not enough investment in customer success, right? particularly the types of customers that our portfolio tends to secure, we're talking about large organizations, multi-billion-dollar type of companies. That's your average customer.
Okay.
And if you don't have people that are managing those relationships, they'll churn. It's very, very uncommon to have the type of product that the stickiness is just there and no one is going to leave ever. But even if you have that, without proper customer success, you'll find something else.
Yeah.
Right? And we've seen that across multiple different verticals, across different companies, across different developers. Customer success is key. So once you start signing those larger contracts, make sure that you're fostering those relationships, because it's always more expensive to sign a new customer versus keeping and growing existing ones, right? So that's one of the issues that we see. The second one is hiring too fast. This is kind of a problem that all startups have, right? Especially when you close that really, really large Series B, the first thing you're going to do is hire 50 people. What you need them for, I don't know, but this is what people do in our industry. And so be very mindful about your hiring plan. And that leads me to the third point, which is once you start growing, it's easy to get blindsided, right? It's easy to start thinking, oh, I have this customer and I have this other customer and they're paying me millions a year. No one is ever going to replace me, right? Because I'm the startup. I'm replacing the incumbents. But after a certain point, you start to become the target of other startups that are going to come maybe 5 years down the line. So never forget, always be aware of your surroundings, and never forget that there's always people out there that will take what you've done and try to improve on it. So you better get going on doing that yourself.
So my last question for you is, what general advice would you give to founders who are seeking to get started in the built environment? Maybe they have an idea, maybe they're sort of toying around with something, they're in a master's or PhD program working on something that has some scientific backing. Like what is your advice to those kinds of founders who might be coming to Pi Labs? Like what do you want to see from them in terms of their preparation and readiness?
I want to see real industry expertise, right? The best founders that we invest in speak to them. They not only speak, they're constantly speaking to the market. They have 10 interviews a week with potential customers or with experts in the space, really, really trying to hone in on that value proposition. So if you're just starting and you don't really have a company yet, but you've done PhD thesis and you're thinking about productizing it, go talk to people and see if they're actually willing to pay for it. We still do that as an investor. We go out and talk to people in our network and ask, would you pay for this? Are you willing to, would you be willing to, I don't know, stop your subscription with this particular product and sign up to this company that we're talking to? Go do that. That is the ultimate test of whether or not you can make a company out of this, make a business out of your idea. The second advice that I usually give to founders, which might sound a little bit controversial, is after you actually start a business, don't necessarily look for funding. Don't go out and raise from VCs. We see that mistake a lot. Founders that have a company, maybe have an MVP, they immediately go out and try to find funds from venture capital funds. It is naturally a good way of financing, but you also need to think about what you're giving up, right?
Exactly.
And not every business needs venture capital money, right? There's plenty of great businesses out there that are very lucrative that have never gotten investment from the venture capital scene ever. And so before you give up on some of the rights, on your ownership and all of that, make sure that you know why you need capital, right? And that your reason to get that capital is fair. Like I said before in the beginning of our conversation, one of my pet peeves is founders that go out to raise just because that's the next thing to do, but they don't really know why, right? So make sure that before you go out to raise, you really have that reason clear, and that VC is your last resort alternative. That's how I like to frame it, right? Before that, try to find friends and family, try to find angels that have invested in this space that are patient before you go to VCs and get involved into shareholders agreement and service agreements and IP assignments and all of that, make sure that you know why you're going to them.
So where do we find you if we're a founder looking for Pi Labs and are thinking we have the best, what's the best way to submit a deck to the team?
Well, I hope I'm quite responsive on social media, particularly on LinkedIn. But if anyone wants to talk to me, just send me an email, hugo@pilabs.vc. Easiest way.
Excellent. And now to the questions that we ask all of our guests. We'll do a round of rapid fire questions. What's one startup trend that you're tired of hearing about?
Generally speaking, I see a lot of companies coming up with a solution and then say something around, and we'll do something with data, right? I find this to be very common with a lot of companies. I'd like to understand a little bit more what the something is. And that trend of trying to make use of the data, I'd like to see a little bit more substance of. For me, it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine to see founders saying, we will do something with the data as if it's an afterthought. So try to think really well about what your product is going to do from day one, obviously with the product development cycle that it needs, but don't come up with ideas that are an afterthought.
What's the most overrated industry for investment right now? You can say it.
I think obviously everyone thinks that everyone's investing in AI, and rightfully so. I think one of the things that we're trying to be very careful about, and I think most VCs are, is what is real AI versus what are application layers on top of AI. And there's still some value in that, but I generally think that the craze of generative AI over the past 18 months has been unsurmountable.
What's a green flag when you meet a founder?
I think when founders are really interested in asking us questions and don't finish a meeting the first time that we meet them, trying to show interest in who we are and asking really, really complicated questions, that for me is a green flag. One that I really like is when founders ask me to get founder references, right? So they want to know more about us. Best way to do it is talking to other founders, the same way that I'm going to talk to founders about their own customers to know more about their business.
What's one deal that you passed on that you regret?
For a very, very, very particular reason, but back in 2013, we had the option to go in a little bit early on Tesla. Unfortunately, we didn't do it because it was a little bit too outside of scope, but it was particularly early, could have been good.
So I know you're an investor, but if you had to start a business tomorrow, what would it be?
For starters, I don't think I'll ever start a business, and we can go into that a little bit more. But if I were to start something, I would want to start something within a deep tech space, solving a really, really particular problem. Because I'm going through the process right now, but something around housing affordability and solving the living cost crisis. I don't know how you can slid deep tech into that specific problem, but it is something that we're quite curious about, and I'm personally very curious about, because we have to build houses, we have to live somewhere, and right now we're missing the solution to do that and the government incentives and support.
Interesting. What's a founder ick? Something that is an immediate turnoff when you're in a conversation with a founder.
For me, it's usually not knowing why they're raising, right? So when founders are talking to us, it's usually because they are looking to raise their next round of capital, or they're going to look to raise. A lot of the times they don't know what they're raising for. They're just going to raise because that's the next thing that you do as a startup. I prefer to speak to founders that know that they have an objective, a goal with that funding round. It's to grow, it's to launch a new product, it's to hire a team, but there needs to be a concrete objective to why you're raising. And don't forget, not everyone needs to raise from VCs, not everyone needs to raise a round. So when you do, be very, very thoughtful about why do you need to do it.
What's an under the cover or under the radar founder or company that you think more people should know about in the industrial space?
Yeah, there's a company that we backed in 2021 called Fulfilled, based out of the US. What they're trying to do is a very, very impressive challenge of basically replacing the warehouse management systems out there. There's a ton of incumbents in this space, and they are trying to build a proper B2B SaaS version of what a warehouse management system should look like. Now, this is a space that's owned by a lot of the incumbents. The incentives are not really there. And when you're fighting against large players, it's the old saying of you'll never get fired for hiring IBM, right? But you might get fired for hiring a super cool new startup like Fulfilled is. So they're on an uphill battle, but their product is really, really interesting. They're closing quite a few interesting customers, and Yosh and Michael are doing an amazing job. They come from the industry, so they really, really know the space.
Interesting. And what's a common belief in the industry or common misconception in the industry that you wish more people had a better understanding of? And when I say the industry, meaning what you focus on, which is the built environment.
Yeah. I think one of the most common misconceptions about built environment is that it is a boring industry, right? And it might be for some people, but the truth is some of the best investments have been made in boring industries, right? If we take, it's a very, very obvious example, but if we take a look at Uber, I mean, that's ride hailing, it's taxi services, it's taking people from point A to point B. It was not an interesting industry by any means, right? And I'd like for more people to understand that actually within the built environment, we're trying to solve some of the most pressing issues that we have in the world. Construction, for example, is responsible for 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It is suffering massive labor shortages. We have a housing and living cost crisis, like I've said before. There's a lot of social inequalities that are brought by this industry. So the problems that we're trying to solve with our fund and other funds out there are very critical to our own well-being. And so I wish more people understood that the built environment might not be as boring as you think.
If you had to bet on one major shift in the built environment in the next 5 years, and you were putting $1 billion of your LP money on it right now, what would it be?
Oof. That's a good question. I think we will not be able to continue building what we are building and without more emphasis on sustainability, right? To give you an example, when you're trying to build any type of development, you use a ton of concrete, right? The margins that you have on concrete to understand its strength and how much quantity you need are very, very slim, and therefore there isn't a lot of space to improve if you're doing things the way you used to do it, right? This uses a ton of water, uses a ton of clinker, and if you can find new solutions that can allow you to play with the numbers a little bit more, you're suddenly talking about saving emissions on the range of 20 to 40%, right? We will need to do that because otherwise we'll not have the materials to be able to build what we need for the generations to come, right? Also, whatever we're going to leave for the younger generations, we need to make sure that it's sustainable. So there is a big investment happening now in retrofitting. And especially if we look around in the UK, a lot of the construction has been done decades ago, and it's no longer fit for purpose. And therefore, a lot of investment will have to go into that space. We need better windows. We need better HVAC systems in commercial spaces. We need better building management systems as well. So I think sustainability is here to stay. Whether we like it or not, whether it's driven by regulation, it is going to be the thing for the next 10 years.
Excellent. Well, Hugo, thank you so much for taking the time and chatting with us, letting us know about PyLab's thesis, about the role of the built environment in decarbonization. And we're excited to see what's next with PyLabs and the companies that you all invest in.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
It was fun.
Very fun.